morning from New York. I'm Chris Hayes. The judge in the case of two high school football players accused of raping a 16-year-old girl in Steubenville, Ohio, said last night he will issue his verdict this morning at 10 o'clock Eastern. MSNBC will be covering it as the verdict comes in on today's Melissa Harris Perry. And Pope Francis celebrated his first Mass as head of the Roman Catholic Church this morning before a packed crowd at Santa Ana Parish in Vatican City. Right now, I'm joined by Democratic Congresswoman Kyrsten Sinema from Arizona, Sam Cedar, host of online political talk show The Majority Report. Oh, there I am. Democratic Congressman Jerry Nadler from New York, and Heidi Moore, economics and finance editor for The Guardian newspaper. Good to have you all here. Am I good? Are we good? The mic's good? All right. This week, Republicans and Democrats in Congress released competing proposals for the fiscal year 2014 federal budget. Big headlines are about two plans in particular, one released by Republican Congressman Paul Ryan, chair of the House Budget Committee, and another released by Senator Patty Murray, chair of the Senate Budget Committee. The Ryan budget is, like previous iterations of this particular product, a conservative wish list. It would turn Medicare into a voucher program, make Medicaid a block grant program, and repeal the Affordable Care Act, among other things. The Murray budget, by contrast, is a much more cautious proposal, with a 1-to-1 ratio of spending cuts and new tax revenue. With all the coverage focusing on these plans, what you wouldn't know is there's a third proposal, one that constitutes a much stronger liberal counterweight to the unbending conservatism of the Ryan budget. That alternative is the budget proposed by the Congressional Progressive Caucus, which would add $2 trillion in new spending to create jobs and pay for it by raising taxes on the wealthy and corporations. The entire discussion about budgeting has been anchored on the right by all the attention the Ryan budget has gotten. So even though it's billed as the Democratic alternative, this is really important. The Murray budget is in some ways closer to the Ryan plan when you take the progressive proposal into account. Check this out. For example, the Ryan budget would cut non-defense discretionary spending, education, transportation, and other social services by 16% over 10 years, according to Citizens for Tax Justice. At the other end of the spectrum, you have the Progressive Caucus budget, which would increase that spending by nearly 28%. So you might expect that Murray's center-left Democratic budget would fall somewhere around halfway between the two, right where you would see that red line, or slightly toward the progressive end of the spectrum. But look at where it actually falls. The Murray budget, which cuts a little less than 1% of non-defense discretionary spending, falls not halfway, but somewhat closer to the Ryan plan. The same is true of other mandatory spending, which includes aid for the poor and unemployed. The Ryan plan would cut those programs by 16%. The Progressives' budget would increase that spending by nearly 44%. So where is the Murray plan? The Murray budget would increase that spending by just 1.5%. Again, much closer to the Ryan end of the spectrum. The Ryan budget would also add no new revenues, while the progressive budget would increase tax revenue by 14%. And the Murray plan, it increases revenue by just 2.3%, which again falls closer to the Ryan end of the scale. Special shout out to Henry Melcher and Sal Gentile and the graphic shop for making that work. I want to set that up because it seems to me that what has been most frustrating about the budget conversation since 2010 is the way the conversation has been anchored. And I thought that was, and this is nothing against Patty Murray, who I think is a quite good senator, and the Murray budget is not a bad document. It's simply to show what the parameters of the debate are right now, in which the Ryan budget is a full-day story. Now, granted, that's the House Majority Caucus. You know, Paul Ryan was a VP candidate. Keith Ellison was not on the ticket. And, you know, the Congressional Progressive Caucus simply doesn't have the same power in the House that the Tea Party caucus has. They're in the minority. And yet, at the same time, it does seem to me like there are real actual costs. There are costs in terms of what kind of budget we're actually going to get, because the center of gravity is so far over towards the Ryan budget. And in fact, when the Ryan budget came out, and then I'll shut up for a second, when the Ryan budget came out, I think there was a sense in which it was like, oh man, he's doubling down. He's ignoring the election results, right? They're still going to repeal the Affordable Care Act. But from his perspective, doubling down and just keeping things anchored there is probably a pretty successful strategy in terms of dragging over the kind of median line that we drew there on the graph. Sam.
Well, it is strange. I mean, because what strikes me, though, about this go-round, well, first off, the real problem starts with this notion of deficit and debt hysteria, which I think is something that goes across the political spectrum far too much than it should in Washington. And I think part of that is because that's what the establishment, in many respects, has decided is the primary problem, as opposed to ongoing lack of employment in this country. And that is still the crisis that we're dealing with. Yet, for a long time, the story has been the debt and deficit. And I think part of the responsibility for that, obviously not all of it, really is the president's, because for an extended period in 2010, 2011, we heard this same sort of silly rhetoric about if a family has to tighten their belt, then the government does too, which no economist believes is actually the prescription.
Well, not no economist, but
you're right.
if it were the case, that would be
I mean, I think
just
it's
about no economist.
Really,
Intelligent economist.
Yeah. Well, and I think there's a wide agreement that we need some type of stimulus here to get out of this morass, and we're not seeing it. And so the only thing I can say that's somewhat encouraging is that there is more attention being paid to the CPC's budget this year than in the past. I mean, nobody talked about the people's budget last year, as far as I can tell.
Right.
So.
Well, I just wanted to say that someone did a Google search of the Ryan budget the day after it was released, 52,000 hits. The same person did a Google search of the Back to Work budget the day after it was released, 7 hits. It just hasn't gotten the attention that it deserves, frankly. It's a very serious budget that we've worked out, that the Progressive Caucus in the House has worked out. It puts 7 million people to work right away on infrastructure. It addresses the primary problem facing the economy, which is a lack of employment and long-term unemployment for a very large fraction of our people. It gets down to primary balance by 2015. It gets the budget deficit down to 1.7% of GDP by 2016, which is better than any of the other budgets.
Let me show that this is also the interesting thing about the CPC budget, is that even in the contours of the question about reducing long-term deficit, it does a better job than the Patty Murray budget, which is the sort of official Democratic response. This is how it would reduce deficit as a share of GDP. It will do that more than the Murray budget. You see, it's a green line there beneath the blue one. The Ryan budget, of course, if he can find the $6 trillion in closing tax loopholes, he says he can. And this is debt as a share of GDP. And again, you see the same thing, which is the progressive budget comes in underneath the Murray budget over time in terms of reducing debt.
The problem with the progressive budget is that one of the really great things about it is that it's incredibly specific about what taxes it wants to raise, which we haven't seen in almost any other budget. Unfortunately, they are all taxes that are guaranteed to turn Republicans into screaming, whirling dervishes. They are all things Republicans hate: a financial transaction tax on Wall Street trades.
Love it.
Taxes on big oil.
Bring it.
Taxing millionaires at 49%.
Come on.
This is everything.
Billionaires,
sorry. This is everything Republicans will never, ever agree to, and we already saw that in the fiscal cliff. So my question is, what's the plan to make them agree?
But Congresswoman, I want to get you on this.
What
is the plan to make them agree? You have a very winning personality, if you don't mind my saying. So the question is, can you, through your force of personality, bring the Republican House caucus over?
Well, Chris, what I think is really sad about this whole conversation and what's happened in the last week is that the American public doesn't care whose budget it is. So you've got Ryan budget, you've got Murray budget, you've got CPC, and you know what the American public says? Can you just solve this problem, please?
Right.
And I think the American public wants, number one, Congress to do no harm. Now, that's a big ask, given what Congress has done in recent years, right? The problem I see with the Ryan budget is it actually hurts the recovery that we're starting to make in our country. And it closes so-called loopholes or tax credits for things that are really important, like the mortgage interest deduction that middle-class families rely on. But with all due respect, neither of the other budgets were formed in collaboration with folks across the aisle either. Right. So you've got 3 budgets all kind of put out in their own silos with no real conversation with the parties together, which means, frankly, none of them are real.
Right.
I mean, none of this is really going to happen.
So this is I think now we're in pay dirt. Go, Sam. Respond to that.
There's 2 things. First, I want to respond to Heidi's question, because what's really even more fantastical than the notion that Republicans would accept the financial.
Can we throw up those taxes? By the way, we have a graphic of those taxes.
What is even more fantastical is that you're going to reverse the Affordable Care Act, and you're going to cut Medicare this way. We're talking, in terms of Medicare, we're talking about a program that even a majority of Tea Partiers do not want touched. So that is far more an absurd notion than the idea that somehow we're going to go back to traditional tax rates that we've had in this country for the vast majority of the.
Although, wait, let me interject for a second. It's not just traditional tax rates. I mean, as you can see there's a bunch of new taxes, right? A carbon tax, a financial transaction tax, all these are in the CPC budget.
But we're never going to get close to the marginal tax rates that we had just 30 years ago.
Yes, agreed.
And but the question as to whether or not these budgets are all fantastical is also, I think, look, we have the sequester right now. There there's really no room we have de facto budgeted everything there is to do.
That's exactly right.
And what we're seeing is competing notions of visions for what the government should do at this point. And essentially, the Ryan budget basically says the government should just go away. And you're not even debating as to whether or not the government, what priorities there should be. It should be just the government shouldn't function in a large way.
The Ryan budget really says we should repeal everything we've done since the New Deal. Get rid of Medicare, get rid of Medicaid.
Well, he doesn't get rid of it. He block grants Medicaid.
He block grants Medicaid, which essentially gets rid of it, because when you block grant it, that is to say, you say here's a pot of money to the state, do whatever you want, and then you say, by the way, we're going to cut it by 2/3.
Right.
It eliminates it over time. He voucherizes Medicare, which is another way of saying let's get rid of Medicare. Throw older people back onto the private insurance market where they were pre-65. Help them a little with premiums, an increasing little amount each year, and reproduce all the problems we had. And don't put money into infrastructure. Don't build roads. Don't build highways. And don't employ people.
But here's my question. Okay, so if we're operating under this in this space in which you have sort of different ends of the spectrum being held down, and Congresswoman, you just said the problem is, the Ryan budget gets put out there, the CPC budget gets put out there. No one's talking to each other. I want to talk about what would be the process, right, in an ideal world? Forget about the process that's happening now.
The legislative process.
Yeah, like literally, what is the process of? Because I basically think like all this talk about a grand bargain is absolutely toxic nonsense. And so I would like to be persuaded that there is some conceivable means of actually coming together in Washington that is not going to end up screwing all the things I care about right after this break.